Hello, my name is Allison Kaplan. I'm director of the May 4 Visitor Center. Hopefully you can hear me and see me this afternoon. This is our first official virtual program. Although I'm a seasoned Zoomer, I am new to Teams in this format. So if you can say hello to me in the chat and comment or share where you're tuning in from, that's great. I also want to let you know if you have questions for today's speaker or for me in relationship to the commemoration and activities here at Kent State, you can always add those into the Q&A. So I want to welcome you here virtually to the May 4 Visitor Center. This is kicking off a whole week of programming related to commemorating the anniversary of May 4, 1970. Um, and we have a number of opportunities, both virtually and in person, to experience this year's commemoration, and a number of opportunities to participate, whether you're interested in teacher programming or a lecture or a concert. There is something for everyone. So please check out Kent State University's online calendar. The May 4 Visitor Center is open all this week from 9 to 5. We have special hours for the commemoration. We will be open all day on Saturday as well as on Sunday, and offering tours of the center, including a tour of Comics of May 4, the exhibition that is now on view in our Reflections Gallery. And we've had a number of programs bringing the artists who are featured in the exhibition here to Kent and to the May 4 Visitor Center to talk about their work and their experiences. And I'm really excited that we could make this work and that we could have Katherine Wirick here with us. Wirick here with us today to speak about her work, which is featured in the exhibition. No One is Safe. The work is originally, the original version of the work is in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts. I came upon the work in the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library at Ohio State University, where a print of it exists. And we are lucky enough that Katherine has donated a print to Kent State University, and that is why it is on view in the Visitor Center here and part of this exhibition. And I'm excited today to have you hear from her and have her walk you through this work and her experience. The work explores her father, which we will get into. And we actually, I brought the yearbook here that features his image, David Wirick. His experience on campus, May 4, 1970, as an ROTC student. In addition to this work that's on view, Katherine also created a comic profiling the anti-Nazi artist John Hartfield, and I'm hopeful that she will talk about that as well today. So we are so excited to have Katherine here with us, and I am going to turn things over to her. She is going to share her screen and her presentation. We should be able to share this out with you if you have to leave, or if you want to share it with someone else throughout after this is over. So I want to encourage you to do that. But we are happy to have Katherine here with us today. So I'm going to invite her to the screen and turn things over to her and encourage you to share questions in the Q&A.
Okay. All right. I hope everybody's hearing me. All right, so I hope everybody's hearing me. Thank you so much for coming and coming to this talk today, and for people who are going to stream this later, thanks for streaming. I'm really glad that you folks are all here. Shout out to a couple of old friends of mine who are on here. And what I'm going to do today is going to talk about this weird thing that I made. I'm going to tell you why it is what it is and where it came from, some of the influences on it. And then I'm not going to tell you the entire story of May 4th, take you through the whole piece, because if you're here, I know that you know the history and you probably have read No One is Safe. So I'm going to take you through some panels and I'm going to tell you some stories that maybe didn't fit in the piece. I'm going to give you some updates on some things. So we're going to go behind the scenes a little bit. And here we go. All right. Um, so this weird thing, um, what it is. This is a picture of me with the original piece at Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. I was a graduate student when I made it, so this was my thesis project. I think probably most of you have not seen the original piece. It is 4 feet square, roughly. And the reason it's that size is that was the biggest piece of paper I could get. Each of the panels is 3 by 4, and they're each mounted onto this piece of paper with the scrapbook corners, the same kind of scrapbook corners that you'd use, for photos in a family scrapbook. So the print is all, the print is printed on one sheet of paper, but the original work has a little bit of dimension to it. The panels are coming a little bit forward, and so that becomes important, at certain points in the piece. I started out um, going on a tour of Kent with my dad. There's the two of us. This was in 2010. He took me on a historical tour. We started with the evening of May 1 and walked me through May 2 and 3, and then finally to the events of May 4. And so I recorded that. I think I had about 3 hours of audio in the end. I transcribed every word of it. As you can see here, this is an excerpt from the transcription. And then I boiled it down and boiled it down and boiled it down until I produced a script, which looked like this. And the script's pretty simple. I was not writing things that were going to be drawn by a different artist, so I didn't have to be very complex and detailed with the descriptions or anything like that. It's pretty much just very basic plan. There were 165 panels. Here's the work in progress in my studio. It took me 4 months to draw, and at the beginning of that 4 months, I did some math, figured out how many panels I'd have to draw per week. It wound up being about 9 panels a week. Now, there's some people who can draw a page a day, so some people will think, well, geez, 9 panels a week is not a big deal. But I'm in the first place, I'm a pretty slow contemplative artist, and in the second place, they're all painted panels, and except for some of them are little charcoal drawings, but most of them are these little ink wash paintings. So 9 panels a week was a push. And I had one of my graduate professors, one of my advisors, when I told him this plan, he said, "Can you do that?" And I said, "I'm gonna." And then when I finished it, I came up to him at my graduation and said, look what I did. So it was an act of will on my part. Um, Now I'm going to move on to this. So those were the material facts of this thing that I made. And now I'm going to talk about why it was all those things that it is. Um, so in grad school, I went to a fine arts grad school. I was working on an MFA. The first year I spent on one painting, I spent the whole year on one painting. It didn't go great. I didn't know that much about painting at the time. And I felt like second year, I felt like, let's go back to my roots. Um, in undergrad, I went to Columbus College of Art and Design. I got an illustration degree. I did comics as an undergrad, never anything particularly good or significant, but I loved comics. And so that was always my idea is I'll graduate college and I'll become a comic book artist. Well, it's not super easy. And I wound up going to grad school, going to a fine arts school, trying to go in a different direction. But the different direction kind of wasn't really where I wanted to go, it turned out. So I went back to thinking about comics, but at PAFA, I had to make work that was going to be destined for a gallery situation. That was, there was no choice about that. I was going to have a gallery show. That was going to be my thesis. I had to do that for graduation. So making a comic book, distributing it the way that comic books are distributed was not really an option. I had to use these gallery walls. And so I started thinking about comics in the context of a gallery, in the context of a wall. Now, think about comics are a uniquely solitary experience. With music, you can play it on speakers, share it with a friend. You can go to movies with a group of people. Even with a book, you can listen to an audiobook with someone else. You cannot do that with comics. Comics are one person at a time. You are the only one that can be immersed in this narrative at the same time. And I thought about, how do we change that? What if a comic was a shared experience? What if it was a more public experience? And I thought, okay, if I want to do this, if I want to somehow put comics on a wall, if I want to make it a public experience, a shared experience, what story am I going to tell? And I thought, what is the best story I know? The best story I know is my father's story of what he saw in Kent in May. So that was when I contacted him. Of course, he was thrilled to help. He took me on the tour. I got started, all that stuff. Um, Now, with this format changes the experience of a comic also, because the idea of a page is no longer relevant here. The page controls what you can take in. And what I'm doing here is I am not controlling what you can take in of this story. You are getting everything at once. Now, if you choose to, you can start up, at the upper left and you can read left to right, top to bottom. You can approach it like that. But before you approach it like that, you are going to see this entire thing. And that can potentially cause a disorienting effect. It can be overwhelming. And that was what I was going for. I was looking to actually throw the viewer, the reader, off a little bit before they entered into this story. Now, what is a panel? A panel is a small unit of time. And when we string together panels, we have a story. We take a small unit of time, we add more of these small units of time, then we have longer time, we have a story. We put multiple pages together, we have a long story. Something that some of you will know is when you experience trauma or when you experience grief, which grief behaves pretty much the same as trauma, um, grief and trauma fracture time, they flatten time. When you have a post traumatic flashback, you are now out of time. The people around you are experiencing the present, but your body is experiencing the past. It's experiencing what happened to you in the past. You are now outside of time. So no one is safe. And no one is safe. I'm flattening time and I'm trying to give you some of the experience of trauma and grief that comes along with the experience of May 4th. At the time that I planned this piece and started working on it, my dad was not sick. So the fact that I'm now destabilizing time and trying to make you feel my experience of pain and grief about his sickness, that just kind of happened. I didn't start out to make a piece about my father being sick. I started to make a piece about my father's story, and then he got sick, and then I had to tell the story of him being sick at the same time. Many, many, many people have asked me if I've thought of publishing No One Is Safe as a book. Absolutely not, because all of those things that I was just saying, those would change. Those elements of it would go away. If it was a book, it would not be the same. So I have done work since No One Is Safe that is meant for a book. This is a page from a book that I did later after No One Is Safe. So I'm not against the traditional comic book format. This isn't some kind of a polemic against that. But No One Is Safe is a different thing. It cannot be a book. All right. So we cannot work alone. We all need to lean on those who came before us. I had some influences that made this work possible. Um, the first one was mouse. I needed a way to distinguish, to differentiate my voice from my father's voice, because I knew that I was going to have two narratives running. And mouse gave me a very clear, very simple template. I think you have probably all read Mouse, but if you haven't read Mouse, it is Art Spiegelman's story of his father. His father is telling the story of his survival of the Holocaust, but at the same time, Art is also telling his own story, telling the story of his relationship with his father. So it's the same thing. It's, it's a father and it's a child. They're both telling their stories at the same time. And he delineates them in a very clear way. His voice is in, it's in regular case, upper and lower case, and his father's voice is in uppercase exclusively. So I went, great, I'll just do that. Side note, I met Art Spiegelman later. He went to a talk, or I went to a talk that he gave in Columbus. I gave him a copy of No One is Safe. He was incredibly sweet to me. He stood there and let me talk to him and say thank you, even though he was dying for a smoke. So I like to tell that story. He was a wonderful, wonderful person when I met him, and I'm grateful. All right. Now we have to talk about rage, because the fundamental emotion, what drives No One is Safe, is rage. But rage is a very, very difficult thing to express in the static visual arts, paintings, comics, things like that, images that don't move, images that sit, because rage is alive. Rage is an emotion. We say rage boils. Rage is an emotion that moves inside you. It moves you. It's not static. It's very, very, very hard to portray rage, even for the greatest, even for the great ones. A couple of them have done it. This is Goya's 3rd of May, 1808. Everything seems to happen in May. This is, of course, Guernica. So these are the only two images that I could think of when I thought of the history of art, and I know art history pretty well. These are the only two images that I could think of that I felt had rage in them, and that the rage came forth, it expressed it. And that's, that's all. It's just two, except now we come to this guy. I had never heard of this guy until I was in graduate school. I was in the college library. I ran across a book, started flipping through it. This is John Hartfield. He was a German artist. He was born in 1891. His birth name was Helmut Herzfeld. He changed his name during the First World War as a protest against German militarism. The English were the enemy at the time during the First World War, and so he changed his name. He translated it into English as a protest. I will need to restrain myself because I could talk about his fascinating life for a week and a half. But this is him at an exhibition of his work that was mounted in Prague in 1935. He was a refugee there at the time. He had escaped Germany in 1933 by the skin of his teeth. His work caused a diplomatic incident between Czechoslovakia and Germany. Germany, the Nazi government, wanted these images taken down. And I'm going to just show you a couple of the images. What he was doing was, the time they were calling it photo montage, it was Photoshop work before there was Photoshop. It was all done by hand. It was all done slicing up photographs, carefully retouching photographs, gluing them together. Very, very difficult, very precise work, and extraordinarily new work at the time. People were blown away by it. He made these pieces for magazines, and they sold magazines. His work was so popular that the Nazis actually started to try to imitate it. Not very well, of course. Fascists aren't good at art. Some of his work is very, very funny. Goering gave a speech about food shortages in Germany. saying iron has always made an empire strong, butter and lard have only made people fat. So the faithful Nazi family celebrates that the butter is gone. They're now going to eat iron and steel. These images are, they're luminous with rage. They are very carefully made. They're not a spontaneous reaction. It's not somebody suddenly screaming in the street. Careful work has been put into them, but the rage in them is inescapable. And when the Germans took Prague in 1938, Hartfield was number 5 on the Gestapo's most wanted list. He had fortunately escaped to England, so they didn't get him. But I think being marked for death by Hitler because of your pictures is about the best thing an artist could aspire to, about the highest achievement he could make. More of this. This is just, it's unforgiving, it's vicious, these images. And I looked at this guy and I saw myself. This is how I was feeling. Now I'm going to talk about a very specific incident, which is relevant to us, relevant to May 4. You're going to hear a lot of stuff that's going to be very familiar. And I'm going to show you a particular piece that he did. So, Blut Mai, 1929. Oh, I got the date wrong there. It was May 3rd, 1929, not 1920. Sorry about that, 1929. So in Berlin in 1929, there was increasingly frequent street violence between Nazis and communists because fascists cannot exist without violence, and the communists were prepared to fight back. And the police responded. Police Commissioner Zorgiebel banned all public marches and demonstrations in the spring of 1929. But the 1st of May is International Workers' Day. That's when the workers march. So the workers marched. It was an unarmed demonstration. It was peaceful. It was simply a march. The police interpreted it as a communist insurrection, and they opened fire. And the violence went on for 3 days. The police fired indiscriminately into crowds, into houses, down city blocks. They killed 38 civilians. There were no police killed. There were no police injured, except for one had a nervous breakdown. But there were 38 civilians killed. There were a couple hundred who were wounded. The police, of course, lied about it. The government newspapers lied about it. No evidence was ever found that the communists were planning an insurrection or that anyone was planning an insurrection. There was no investigation into the police response. There were no charges against police. There were no resignations. This is all, we know how this is. We know what this is. The history repeats. John Hartfield went into the killing zone on May 3rd. And he came out and he made this image. So that's Commissioner Zorgiebel in the bottom right corner. I saw this image. It's all in the eyes. He's put in with white retouching liquid. He's put in the highlights in the eyes, and the highlights in the eyes are what make the image alive. They make the glare. They bring the anger into this picture. They bring the rage into this picture. I saw this picture. I put it up on my studio wall. I put up some of his other images on my studio wall, and they showed me how to do what I was trying to do. Not in a literal way. I wasn't copying, but just looking at them. Just looking at them helped me understand how to create an image that feels, how to understand what I felt, and how to make my hands produce something that, for lack of a better term, expressed how I felt, So, a side note about Blutmai. Blutmai substantially contributed to the rise of the Nazis in Germany because the party that ran the government was the Social Democrats. at the time. And what that meant was that the Communist Party would not cooperate with the Social Democratic Party, because the Social Democratic Party were the party that, they were in control of the police, they were in control of the investigation, which did not happen. They were in control. It was their officials. Zorgiebel was an SPD member, took no responsibility. So, the communists saw the Social Democrats as killers and liars. And so they did not join hands with the SPD. And so there was no left and center left coalition in Germany in 1932, 1933 to hold back the fascists. So that incident, that police overreaction, killing people at a peaceful demonstration, had very severe ramifications. Moving on. So now we're going to get back into No One is Safe. Going to talk about some panels, some background, some stories, things like that. We're going to start right up here. So ROTC. So my dad graduated from high school in 1968. He was 18 years old. This was the height of the Vietnam War. It was the high point of the draft. It was the year that we sent the most soldiers over there. It was the year of the Tet Offensive. And my dad had mixed feelings about draft resistors. He understood that, it was legitimate for someone to have moral reasons not to want to fight the war, not to want to be drafted. He accepted that. There was nothing wrong with that. But his feeling was that if he took a college deferment, or if he went to Canada or something like that, that didn't mean that the Army was going to send one less kid over there than they were planning to. They were going to send a kid in his place. And the kid that they were going to send in his place was probably going to be one of the kids he grew up with, a working class kid, someone who didn't have a lot of resources, maybe, someone with a learning disability, someone who did not have the resources to dodge the draft. That was the person who was going to go in his place. So he had kind of mixed feelings about draft resistors. And he also had a sense of obligation that, as an American citizen, it wasn't exactly my country, right or wrong, but he was a citizen. He felt that America had given him a lot, and he had an obligation to service. However, he also wanted to go to college. So he kind of split the difference, and he joined ROTC. At that point, he had every reason to believe that he was going to go to Vietnam in 1972. But he got very lucky, and he didn't. They sent the class of 71 to Vietnam. They did not send the class of 72. So I'm going to talk about the Army a little bit. Okay, so instead of being deployed to Vietnam, he was deployed to Fort Cavazos in Texas. Fort Cavazos used to be called Fort Hood, but the Army has renamed all the old Confederate forts, which is great. That's cool. So he commanded a battery of 5 M109 howitzers. That's what these things are. A lot of people look at these and assume that they're tanks. They're not tanks. They're mobile guns. Tanks have armor to protect the people inside. These things are pretty much made of tinfoil. One thing I just want to point out real quick, something that I love about this picture is ever since there's been artillery and photography, this is how artillery guys stand. So elbow on the gun, hand on the hip, lean, look real cool. So I love that about this photo. Now, at the time that I did No One is Safe, as you can see in the bottom right corner, there were some things that I couldn't say. Some of that stuff has been declassified since then. So what I can tell you now is Cavazos had a nuclear arsenal. And these things, the M109, they could fire nuclear warheads. And so one of the things that was his responsibility, besides intelligence and security clearances and paperwork, was training the 4-man gun crew on each of these guns to put together the nuclear warhead. They called it the Big Blue Bullet. We're going to come back to that. This is a piece of work that I did. It was just after he died. And the thing about my dad was, if you knew him, you would never think, oh yeah, that guy spent some time in the army. He was there for 3 years. He didn't have, that army personality, that drill sergeant, stereotypical personality. I didn't grow up feeling like an army brat. It didn't come up very much. But it did sometimes. It was still in his language. He said, Kate, you've been a soldier about this. It would come through sometimes. So it did mark him being in the army. It stayed with him in his language, in his mind. It stayed with him in another way. We'll talk about that later. All right. So on to Governor Rhodes. I'm not sure if the university hosts these recordings. I can't remember where the recordings are, but you can listen to the recordings of this press conference, and there are these slamming sounds, these thumps that you'll keep hearing while Rhodes is talking. It's because he's banging his fist on the table as he says these things. A funny thing about Rhodes is after my father got out of the army, he had some public sector jobs. He wound up getting a job for the state of Ohio. Rhodes was still governor at the time, so he was actually working for Rhodes at that point in the late 70s, early 80s. And he didn't really hold grudges about things. He wasn't that kind of person. I grew up knowing Rhodes because I had a friend, my best friend in elementary school lived in a very wealthy area around the corner from Rhodes's house. And so I knew him as the guy who would give out full candy bars on Halloween. That was how I knew him. And, at some point, my parents mentioned, oh, that's Governor Rhodes's house. So that was Governor Rhodes to me, is the guy who would give out full candy bars. So, best guy in the neighborhood, full candy bars on Halloween. I didn't know about Kent. I didn't know the role that he played in it. If he had, I don't think I would have been going to his house for candy bars. I think I would have been doing other things to his house potentially. So it's probably a good thing I didn't know. But yeah, Dad didn't say, don't go to this guy's house. He's a terrible person. He contributed to the killing of 4 students when I was in college. He never told me that. He didn't carry grudges. I do. We're very different people. All right. Now we're going to come to a turning point. And this is where what I was talking about before about the dimension of the original piece is going to be relevant. So right here. The guard decided that instead of just telling the students to disperse, we will disperse them. So that is when the movement begins that ends with killing. And that is a turning point in No One is Safe. That is the first time that we drop away from these panels that are pasted on to the large paper. The panel on the right is drawn with pencil directly onto that big piece of paper. So we are dropping out of the narrative that I have been telling. We're literally going behind it. This is the process of me creating the work, and it's a very tormented process. In fact, the pencil panels are the ones that are kind of hard for me to look at these days. I've read this piece a lot since I made it so that I could talk about it, but I don't really like to look at the pencil panels that much. Okay. So now we're coming up to the turning point. Here we go. I think Backdurf might actually be here. Those of you who went to Durf's talk, you'll remember in his book, he depicts the guard opening fire, the killing of the students in a very direct, very graphic, quite violent way, and he gave his rationale for doing so, which is he had very good reasons for doing so. I was not able to do that because as I was drawing this, as I was putting together these little pictures, it felt like a reenactment. And this particular moment when the guard opens fire was not something that I could bring myself to reenact. I could copy images that already existed, like, the girl, dad called her the Mona Lisa picture, the Marianne Vecchio on the ground. I could copy that picture. I could copy other pictures, but creating a picture, putting images together, putting figures together felt different. It felt like I was reenacting it, and I could not bring myself to do that. Okay. So my father's judgment about what happened, he did not subscribe to conspiracy theories. He did ask questions about how the ROTC building got burned down. Um, And if you read Durf's book, it actually answers a lot of the questions that my father had. There's a lot of information in there that my dad didn't know, and some things that kind of explain what happened. But he didn't subscribe to grand conspiracy theories. Some people say that Nixon had decided that he was going to make an example of students, things like that. He didn't subscribe to that. He was one of those people who would say, given the choice between conspiracy and stupidity, choose stupidity every time. So he felt that it was terrible. It was a tragedy. It was a terrible mistake, very bad decision making, ineptitude on the part of the guard. That was how he saw it. He saw it as a tragedy and a mistake. Now, about the last panel, the guy from the 82nd, I want to note that I'm not saying that American paratroopers have never made a mistake, but when Eisenhower wanted to protect the children in Little Rock that were trying to integrate Central High School in Little Rock, he sent the 101st Airborne and nobody got killed. The National Guard were not trained for this kind of work. They just weren't. They weren't in the 1950s. They weren't in 1970. Okay. As I've been taking you through this story, I've been giving you these diagrams to keep you oriented. Spatial diagrams are kind of essential to this particular story. So these are my diagrams. And then the final diagram shows you where the bile duct is. The bile duct is where my father got cancer, called cholangiocarcinoma, cancer of the bile duct. It's down in your digestive system there. And I chose to draw this diagram because at this point, the campus has become a body. It's become my father's body, and there is a malignant force inside of his body. And so I created this diagram in the same style as the other diagrams because now he is the campus. Okay. So let's talk, speaking of malignant forces and destruction, let's talk about property destruction. So property destruction, as we all know, it makes news, terrifies the middle class. There we go. It starts the cycle of state violence. And why does it happen? Why did it happen? Why did it happen on May 1st? Why did people start smashing windows? After my dad died, I lived in Athens, Ohio, which some of you will know that's where Ohio University is. My husband was a grad student there at the time, and those of you from Ohio probably also know that it's one of the biggest party schools in the country. So kind of a shithole. There was broken glass everywhere all the time. And what I used to do after my dad died, sometimes I would take glass bottles out of the recycling and I'd go out back of my apartment, and I would fling them against the dumpster as hard as I could and watch them smash. And that made it tolerable for a few minutes. Destroying something made it tolerable, made the way that I was feeling tolerable. And so at this point, the distinction between me and the students of 1970, the people who were throwing bricks, smashing windows, there is no more distinction. That difference has gone away. I have fallen into the story of May 4, 1970, essentially. And why did students smash windows? Um, was it a protest against the Vietnam War? Was it that college kids are dumb when they're drunk? Was it bikers from out of town? We don't know. Did somebody on that night, on May 1st, did somebody throw a brick because their father was dead and they couldn't stand it? We don't know. I can't prove that they did. We can't prove that they didn't. And now we go into the last row. Trichloroethylene. It's also called trichloroethene. It's called TCE. It's used as a metal degreaser and a lubricant. And back down at Fort Cavazos, they used it to lubricate the threads on the Big Blue Bullet. And it was a powder. It was kept in a can. And when you opened the can, the powder would puff out. And so you'd breathe it in and it would be all over your hands. So he was exposed to it very, very frequently. Uh, the EPA listed it as a probable human carcinogen in 2001. The 3 studies linked it to liver and bile duct cancer. There were a lot of other studies that linked it to other kinds of cancers and other kinds of harm to the body. The Pentagon fought back very, very hard against that listing, against the EPA listing it as a human carcinogen and against any kind of new regulations. Donald Rumsfeld personally was involved in bullying the EPA and getting more studies, getting any kind of progress on it, basically pushed back. So basically, it was, oh, we'll schedule a study in whatever time, but they were basically pushing it out of, pushing the issue away. And the Pentagon was the leader of that fight. NASA and the Department of Energy were also involved, unfortunately. And of course, the Bush administration sided with the Pentagon. And the reason they were doing that was not that they were still using so much TCE, but they didn't want to pay to clean up dump sites. And there were a lot of dump sites. There was a whole Marine base, Camp Lejeune, that was poisoned by TCE. There's been a lot of people across the country made sick by TCE, and the Pentagon doesn't want to pay to clean up those sites, and they don't want to pay for health care for people who've been sick. So that was the reason for the reaction. Where we are now, the EPA proposed a complete ban on it just last year. The Biden administration is supporting that. So I don't agree with the Biden administration on quite a few things, but I support that. I'm glad he's doing that. So yeah, the Army gave my dad cancer. The destructive force in his body was a military force. This is a diagram of the 2 narratives that are happening, although it's actually 3 narratives. All of the blue panels are the ones where my father is telling a story. I'm sorry, and I'm telling the story. It's the story of May 1970. All the blue panels are telling the story of May 1970. The red panels are so sorry. The red panels are my story, stories from my childhood, the story of creating the piece. So you can see here where we jump back and forth from blue to red, we're jumping in time. And as we go towards the end of the piece, time is increasingly fractured until we've completely slipped out of the narrative of May 4th that we started with. Pardon me, just a sec. Okay. And at this point, we're almost at the end of the story. Time has completely flattened. Everything is happening all at once. There is no more linear time. Um, we're experiencing a traumatic flashback. We're experiencing multiple traumatic flashbacks at once. Um, everything is happening at once. Time is no longer relevant at this point. Time has fallen apart. And now we come back to the beginning. And as we all know, history repeats itself. Students speak out, students protest, politicians call for violence. We see this happening. Everything repeats. I hope on campuses across the country right now, I hope there are no repeats of exactly what happened on May 4th. I hope there are no killings, of course. But history repeats. So we've come to the end, and the end is the beginning. Now this has been a pretty big bummer, this talk. So I'm going to tell you one more story at the end. To tell you a story about my Aunt Carol. So my Aunt Carol didn't have a car. My father went to get her. She was also a student at Kent State at the time. So my father went to pick her up so that he could drive her home. And my Aunt Carol lived in a house off campus with a bunch of other girls at the time. So my dad got to the house, and at the time, the highway patrol, the police, they were starting to do house to house searches. Everything was chaos. Nobody knew, all the students knew was that they were being forced to leave campus. They didn't know what was going to happen. Everything was chaos. No one knew what was going to happen. So when my dad got to my Aunt Carol's house, he walked into the house, and all of the girls in the house, including my aunt, were sitting cross-legged on the floor in a circle, smoking all of their weed as fast as they could. Because, the cops might find it when they search your house, and you can't just flush it. You can't throw it away. You can't waste good weed. So that's the end of my presentation there. I hope maybe that cheered you up a little bit.
Thank you so much, Catherine. This was really fabulous. I learned so many things, and it was so interesting to hear the background of the work. I want to encourage people, if you have a question, you can put it in the Q&A. I'm wondering if you can speak about your research for this project. You do such an amazing job rendering some of the people involved, like Governor Rhodes with the saliva in his mouth, and there are some pictures like the students gathered where like the renderings of the students are just beautiful works of art. I wanted you to talk a little bit more, if you could, about that research process and translating some of what you were researching into artwork.
Yeah. So for any of you who've read Durf's book or went to Durf's talk, my research is nothing in comparison to his. I worked on this for a year. I had access to archives of online photos, but I didn't go anywhere near the depth that he went into. So I want to say that in the first place. You know what, I've got it right here on my laptop. Go, no one is safe. I had a backup of this folder. This was the folder that all my stuff was in when I was working on the piece 10 years ago, and I just copied it here. So let me switch over to share again. Okay, so This is my research folder. I had things sorted out by subject. Um, had a lot of screenshots from a documentary that a lot of you had probably seen. Um, Not quite sure what I can say in terms of rendering the images. It's just kind of the way I work. The actual process of painting these little panels is basically pencil drawing, and then I start out with very, very diluted India ink. So it would start out with a very, very, very light gray, and then I would just build up and build up and build up until I got to till I finally got to tones that were very dark. And then in some cases I would go in with the pure ink, but not always. So I'm sure Durf's photo collection is so much better than this. I did have Howard Ruffner's images. He was one of the student photographers at the time, and he had put them online in high resolution. So that was great. I'm incredibly thankful to all the student photographers, but those pictures by Howard Ruffner were essential. I don't know if I've answered the question exactly.
You're fine. That's perfect. I just was like, I guess it's the also thinking about, and this is, I have two other questions for you, but this kind of high versus low in relation to thinking about comics and art and May 4. So you sort of talked about it in relationship to this is your MFA thesis project. You can't approach it from a comic viewpoint. Um, I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more about that tension and the way
Oh yeah.
that you approached it in your work.
Yeah, I would love to actually. I, well, after I got out of college with my illustration degree, I went to a fine art school in Ireland. Ireland was fantastic. The school was terrible. And I really found myself looked down on because of my illustration degree. Um, so I left there after a year. Came back here, worked various jobs for a while, and then I went to PAFA. And PAFA was a much more welcoming place because PAFA has a substantial history of great illustrators. Jesse Wilcox Smith went there. There's a long, long list of very, very well-known important illustrators that went there. And it's a very old school, so it has a long history. So it was more acceptable. It was more, when I was there, it was a lot more acceptable to do, let's say, pictures of things that look like the things that they look like. Um, what you would call representational art, that was a lot more acceptable. Just when I was at the school in Ireland, you know, if you drew a picture of something, that was not particularly respected. If you painted a picture of something, that was not particularly respected. It was very high modernist, abstraction, postmodernist, performance art. That was the kind of stuff that was acceptable. Um, and at PAFA, it was a lot more acceptable. I mean, PAFA still has a tradition of representational art, traditional painting, traditional drawing. I had some problems with a few faculty, and this was really interesting. There were a few faculty who felt that using words and pictures together was not art. And they gave me a real hard time. These were one of them was in her 50s, some of them were younger, so it wasn't really a generational thing. I think it was more, these were fairly modernist um, people, and so I think it was a matter of philosophy. But I remember one of them at one point said, when someone walks into the gallery, they don't expect to see a bunch of words on a wall. And I was like, when someone walks into a gallery, they want to see something new that challenges them. They want to see something they didn't expect. Isn't that the point? Um, but so that kind of got me down a little bit. That resistance was frustrating. I did also have some faculty members who were very, very, very in my corner and very significant, very important to helping me get this done. So I don't want to give you a bad impression of the PAFA faculty because most of them were fine. was just a couple of just a very small minority of people. But this small minority was kind of loud because I had to defend No One Is Safe basically because it was my thesis. I had to stand up in front of it and in front of all the students and the faculty would give me their thoughts and their criticisms. And there was kind of an argument between different factions of faculty about it. But anyway, but the undergrads were so into it. When I was a TA for a class, and at one point, they all came into my studio and they just like they dug it. They were so into it. And so that was like, I couldn't be too bothered by other people saying that what I was doing wasn't art when I had, 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds who were so excited about it. It was like, you guys are the voices that matter. I don't need to worry about these other people. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Cool.
So, one of the last questions I have for you, we have a faculty research group that meets, and last week we were talking about within the graphic content exhibition, this idea of the narrator. And with a DERF book, obviously, like it's 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 not totally neutral, but it comes from a kind of neutral place. The narrator doesn't inject themselves in a personal way. And yours is very personal. And you talked a little bit about your rage and your dad, his experience, and kind of just being like, okay, well, that's Governor Rhodes. Like, don't really hold a grudge on things. But when you inject it, you're so full of rage. I just want to hear more from you about like injecting yourself into the May 4 experience and what that was like.
Well, when I was initially conceptualizing it, I thought I should also bring in the story of Jackson State, because that is part of the story. But I didn't know anybody who was at Jackson State, and I didn't have the resources to get in touch with people, to go there, to do the research. I did not have the kind of resource that my dad was for Jackson State. And so I finally thought, um, even though this is a part of the story that isn't represented as much as it should be, I thought I'm not the person to represent it. This isn't the place to represent it because it just won't be as strong as the story of Kent State. It'll feel like an afterthought in a way. So that was the choice that I made there, to stay with something that was firsthand rather than trying to take a broader, significantly broader historical view. Um, about putting myself into the piece, some of it was cathartic. I mean, I think actually a lot of it was not healing exactly, because you don't heal, but helpful. I think it was helpful that I was doing this piece at the same time as my dad got sick. I don't really know what would have happened if I'd been trying to work on some totally unrelated project and then dealing with, the I would be thinking about him constantly while I was trying to do a painting of whatever. I don't know what have happened there. I don't know if it would have worked. Um, it's, ultimately art is better than throwing glass bottles at a dumpster. Um, it wasn't always it the process of it was sometimes very difficult, and it wasn't always the action of it was not like Jackson Pollock moving my body around, hurling paint in this way and that. It was very small pictures, very detailed work. But as it came together, there was a certain catharsis. And in the end, it was almost like I was kind of inflicting my rage on people in an acceptable way. rather than I could have gone around, and I felt like it, I could have gone around grabbing people by the shoulders and yelling at them. But I made this piece, which is in some ways that. And so, that was a helpful thing, because that's, a socially acceptable way of doing what I instinctively wanted to do. Does that answer your question?
It does. Do you, when before you knew your dad was ill, what was the approach? Were you initially injecting yourself in the story as the narrator? How were how were you looking at it when you started versus where you were when you ended?
I was only going to be a part of it. I was still going to be involved in it. I was still going to be coming in to say, to talk about the Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young record, to say, I remember this from childhood, to come in and give some background on, that after college, my dad went in the army and this and that. The pencil panels, the really the really pained pencil panels, I don't think were a part of my early plan for the piece. I think that started to happen after he got sick, and after the later parts of the piece started to change. I think it wound up being a lot more narratively fragmented than it would have been otherwise. I think if he hadn't gotten sick, it probably would have been a little bit more educational, if I could say that. Yeah, my memory's kind of fuzzy on it. But yeah.
Well, Catherine, I want to thank you so much. I was especially blown away the way that you framed talking about the Kent State campus in relationship to your father's body and the mapping. That really brought some new dimension to the work. So I really want to thank you for speaking here today. Again, we've recorded this and we plan to push it out to people who were unable to join us. And I want to remind anyone who is viewing this, whether you're local or you're planning to visit for the commemoration, we are this exhibition, Graphic Content Comics on May 4, is open until Friday, June 7th. And we will have special hours for the commemoration, including a special tour Sunday, May 5th from 10 to 11. So we hope that you can join us then. Catherine, thank you so much. Are there
Thanks.
is there something that you're working on now, comic related, that you can tell us about really quickly?
I've actually been painting a lot the last 4 years. And because I actually know how to do it now. um, there's a project that I'm working on that don't really want to talk about, just because it might end up coming to nothing. I've also been obsessed with the Challenger disaster for about a year now, and I keep saying I'm not going to make comics about it, but probably someday I will. So yeah,
There's
but
plenty of
unfortunately, I can't be more detailed than that.
no, that's fine. Well, thank you, Catherine. Wirick, we are so happy to have you here today and to have your donation of the print to Kent State and the oral history of your walkthrough of the tour with your dad to Kent State Library's special collection, May 4 archive as well. And that is accessible online. So anyone who did watch today and wants to do the walkthrough with Catherine and her father, you can read that transcript as well. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks
And
for having me.
we hope to connect with everyone throughout this week. And also thanks to the May 4 archivist, Liz Campion, who has dropped in a lot of great links to enhance this talk today. So thanks so much. Have a great evening and hope to see everyone later this week. Thank you.